Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I know some other people are coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Judy Wu. I'm a professor of Asian American Studies, and I also direct the UCI Humanities Center. I'm so honored to introduce Mai-Linh Hong today. She's an assistant professor of literature at UC Merced, who's already an intellectual leader in the fields of Asian American literary studies and critical refugee studies. She's presenting today as part of an intellectual exchange between the UC Humanities Centers, and I especially want to thank UC Merced's Center for the Humanities for partnering with us on this endeavor. I also want to thank Ju-Hoon Sin, who is operating the Zoom room. And just to let you know, we're planning to live stream Mai-Linh's talk portion, but we will turn that off during the Q&A so that we hope that you can engage freely in conversation. I also want to thank Ryan Gurney, who's been so supportive in organizing this event, Professor Dorothy Fujita-Roney of Asian American Studies, encouraging her graduate class to attend. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Thuy-Vo Dang, who is the curator for an exhibition called Literally Displaced, is an exhibition on Southeast Asian diasporic literature. It currently lives on the internet, though we plan to hold an in-person celebration, an in-person exhibition that will hopefully happen in early next month. So I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Hong in 2019 when the Southeast Asian Studies section hosted a conference in conjunction with the Association for Asian American Studies conference in Wisconsin. And I was luckily fortunate enough to be paired with her to read her very powerful work. And I was so thrilled that she became a colleague in the UC system last year. And she made this transition a very difficult period of the pandemic. She's currently working on her first monograph, Perilous Telling, Stories in the Shadow of the Refugee Regime. Story in the Shadow of the Refugee Regime, and we'll have a chance to learn from her more about her work today. In addition, she served as co-chair of the Circle of Asian American Literary Studies, an international scholarly society dedicated to the study of Asian American literature, culture, and arts. I'm on the listserv, and I'm just so blown away by how supportive this particular community is, that people celebrate each other's achievements and support one another. So it's a really wonderful community to become involved in. I also had the pleasure of reviewing Professor Hong's co-edited volume, The Anti-Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice. It was just published by UC Press in 2021. I encourage everybody to explore both the book and the group that inspired it. They exemplify radical care through the voluntary efforts to create personal protective equipment for essential workers in vulnerable communities. So as you can tell, Professor Hong is a person with deep political convictions that she embodies through her actions and her mentorship. Her scholarship exhibits a similar ethos of care. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hong for her talk today, Story in the Shadow of the Refugee Regime.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Judy. And thank you to Judy Wu, Thuy-Vo Dang, and Dorothy Fujita-Roney for making space for inviting me to be here. So it means a lot to me to be in this particular space and with you all, being relatively new to the UC system. And this feels like a very good way to enter the lively academic life of the UC. So thank you. I just have a few slides today, but I'll share those with you. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you about some ideas in progress from my book, Perilous Telling, Story in the Shadow of the Refugee Regime. And the ideas are going to go into the introduction and the first chapter. And these are very much in progress, so I am really thrilled to be presenting them and in conversation about them. And I really welcome your reactions and suggestions and thoughts afterwards. So I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Let me tell you a story, for all I have is a story. Trinh T. Minh Ha. My father is a natural storyteller. It takes only a Heineken and minimal prodding to get him started. One afternoon, over a long meal, he told me the story of how he survived the re-education camps in which he was imprisoned after the Vietnam War. He was an officer in the South Vietnamese Army, and shortly after the war ended was ordered to report for re-education. So he and his fiancée, my mother, quickly married, and he left to begin his indefinite detention. Between shifts of hard labor, my father was interrogated about his activities during the war. Re-education camp prisoners were executed if it was determined that they were not ideologically salvageable or they had participated in certain unforgivable activities during wartime. So my father lied, of course, minimizing his wartime activities to maximize his chance of survival. Lying was easy. Keeping track of the lies, day after day, interrogation after interrogation, was harder. So he wrote down his lies on a piece of paper, which he buried in the dirt. After each interrogation, he dug up the paper, added to the ongoing account of things I did in the war, and buried it again. He survived. I don't know what kind of records are kept by his interrogators. If they documented my father's answers, what they compiled was a fictional account, his fictional account, of wartime activities rendered to appear as benign as possible to a hostile regime. Stories saved his life and created the possibility of mine. I grew up surrounded by stories like these. Stories of war and its after effects, and stories of war. So little wonder I became a literary scholar, and my younger brother is actually a fiction writer. Today I work on refugee literature, and as a first-gen scholar, I know I'm incredibly lucky to pursue my curiosity for a living. I'm interested in the stories refugees tell and what the telling reveals to us about the universe in which these stories circulate. Specifically, I look at how refugee stories engage with other stories that are already circulating, and what this has to do with the political and legal apparatuses that set the terms of refugee survival, that is, the refugee regime. Refugees' stories don't emerge in a narrative vacuum. Regimes tell stories too. I'll return to this. In the book I'm writing, I often use personal and familial stories as an entryway for intellectual inquiry. This method follows a long line of women of color feminist scholars who understand that it's no small thing to be able to see oneself in the lessons taught in school, that is, in more official, authoritative forms of knowledge. My efforts to narrate my spotty family history in spite of lessons I was taught in school and elsewhere inform my understanding of both knowledge and story. Growing up, I was inundated with narratives about Vietnam, in textbooks, films, news stories, books, nearly all from the perspective of white male veterans of America's war. I recognized myself in none of them. Was I supposed to be the dead or naked child on a dirt road? Was I the Vietnamese prostitute offering, always offering? Was I the grateful refugee falling at the feet of a white savior? In the words of one of my wiser students, I got it, but I didn't get it. That is, I recognized the roles, but I didn't choose them. Even when I began to encounter literature by Vietnamese refugees or children of refugees, which was around late high school or college, I was startled to meet in these narratives the familiar signs of what I now think of as navigational storytelling. That is, I saw the ways that these writers had to navigate, had to encounter, acquiesce to, reframe, or dodge, sometimes challenge, the prevailing American myths of who we were and where we came from. The metaphor of navigation is purposeful. It references refugees' physical migration, sometimes across dangerous terrain, and it describes their knowing, figurative engagements with the pre-existing narratives that circumscribe their futures. Perilous telling theorizes refugee knowledge making as a strategic storytelling process carried out under the legal, social, and political precarities of forced migration. Story is fundamental to how refugees perceive, understand, and survive their more or less dire legal and political circumstances. How refugees know is linked to how refugees tell in a world full of others, non-refugees, who either assume their silence or speak for them. In a way, my book picks up from Spivak's foundational question for postcolonial studies. Instead of asking, can the subaltern speak? I ask, how does the subaltern speak in a world already full of stories about them? The book centers the experiences of people who live outside or in the borderlands of the knowledge market of the academy. So I want to present scholarly ideas in a way that's readable and understandable to many, and storytelling helps with that. When I say I'm theorizing story or knowledge, I am in part claiming theory as a domain in which refugees may intervene with their perilous tellings, the distinctive strategic forms of knowing and speaking that evolve out of refugee survival. This is a very personal move, and one that I think many in this room will understand. I was the first in my family to attend college, and I'm not sure how much my parents know about what I do for a living, even though they are integral to what I do and what I write about. Broadly speaking, ethnic studies honors knowledge from the margins and accepts story as a vital mode of knowledge production. Reflecting on the field of critical refugee studies, Yenle Espiritu writes, over the years, I have looked for ways to tell the story of the refugee, not as an object of study, but as a source of knowledge, unquote. I'd like to think through today what this phrasing can mean, the story of the refugee. So scholars might seek and value the story of the refugee in different ways according to their disciplinary tools. The tools at my disposal come mostly from literature and law, though working in ethnic studies, of course, we learn to engage with work by scholars who use tools that are different from our own. As a literary scholar, I start by asking, what is a story? So we can get very theoretical about this, but I will spare you the rabbit hole to Russian formalism, which I have fallen down a couple times, and propose that we think of story as any telling of a set of events or circumstances, or a story as any telling of a set of events or circumstances. And we often use the terms story and narrative interchangeably, but I find it helpful to distinguish between them. A narrative is a selection and ordering of events that can take form through many different tellings. It has the potential, as Peter Brooks noted, for summary and retransmission. A story is a particular telling. So seemingly disparate tellings can transmit what boils down to a single recognizable narrative, and vice versa. One narrative can be conveyed repeatedly through a variety of forms and media through a variety of tellings. To think critically about story is to think about not just the content or the form of a story or the narratives it engages and how, but also about the scene of telling. Story is active because it requires someone to do something, tell. And story is social because tellers never tell without an audience, even a vague or unintended one. So as a note, I often talk about story as a noun without an article, like not a story or the story, but story as a process or as a set of skills. And this is a way of abstracting the concept so that we can talk about it without referring to a particular story or a particular telling, but rather the conditions of story itself or how story functions. So since we're talking about story in relation to refugees, what is a refugee? Generally, a refugee is a person who's been forced to leave home and can't return due to persecution, conflict, or calamity. Scholars often talk about the refugee as a way to generalize and critique the conditions of refugee life. Of course, refugees inhabit complex identities and histories, so there isn't one typical refugee. When we abstract the refugee, it's often a way to index something external to refugees themselves. For example, the legal conditions that make it nearly impossible for most refugees to find safe, stable homes, or the social and political expectations that are laid upon refugees who do manage to get resettled. The refugee means refugees who are subject to those conditions. And what we focus on, again, varies according to our tools and our motivations. So broadly speaking, the refugee is a socio-political figure that emerged after World War II, largely in response to international failures to protect European Jewish people during the Holocaust, and as a way to handle the mass post-war European Jewish migrations. This figure is shaped by new legal and political regimes that were being constructed at that time, along with discourses of humanitarianism and human rights. So these were institutions and processes that emerged after World War II. When I mentioned earlier that regimes tell stories, this is what I mean. Discourses frame an institution or process as doing a certain thing, for example, saving refugees, when in reality, something else might be happening. As a lawyer or as a legal scholar, I went to law school and practiced law for a few years before escaping back to the academy. As a lawyer, I would point to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, which govern refugee protection internationally. And from that standpoint, a refugee is someone who is outside their country of origin and can't return due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on certain identity traits. This is a very narrow definition, and it was meant to be. Most people we think of as refugees do not meet this definition, so their right to protection is limited. I just looked it up this morning. The UNHCR reports that today there are 91.9 million people of concern, that is people who might be refugees. And it's interesting because when I started writing on this topic, I think the number was more like 60 million. And every time I've given a talk or written an article, I've had to look it up again and the number keeps growing. So 91.9 million people of concern. And history tells us that less than 1%, probably far less than 1% of these will ever be resettled or find another durable solution through UN processes. So that's why in my work, I call the refugee regime the apparatus that sets the terms of survival for refugees, what refugees must do or endure to seek safety, rather than how the regime might describe itself, which is as a humanitarian structure. And finally, coming from literary studies, I might think of the refugee as an archetype, an exemplary character with a familiar set of traits. So some examples of archetypes are the outlaw, the hero, the native informant. These are types that are known to us. So as readers or listeners, we bring prior ideas and assumptions to a story. We have expectations when we encounter one of these figures. And storytellers know that usually. So they might fulfill or challenge our expectations as part of how they tell a story. Although even if they aren't aware of that or aren't thinking about that, these prior ideas still come into play. So authorial vision or intent doesn't govern completely how we make meaning out of the text. So these ideas are still with us as readers when we encounter a text or a story. And this has, of course, implications for literary studies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. For refugees, story is very closely associated with knowing. Refugee knowledge, that is how we understand and interpret, how we make meaning, arises as refugees gather and organize information in the interest of survival. The gathering and organizing, I argue, are also story making. And we see this everywhere in refugee life, in refugee literature, certainly, but also in refugees' daily strategic self-presentations and performances, and in juridical testimonies, advocacy, and appeals, also in intentional memory making that refugees engage in. These all happen as refugees navigate the various societies in which they sojourn. To some extent, all humans crave and create narrative when they process the world around them. So refugees aren't, unique in that. But for refugees, this dynamic between story and knowledge is accentuated because when you live with constant contingency and limited options with very high stakes, information is everything. And information must be selected, ordered, given context, and conveyed or withheld to be useful. Information must have a kind of logic, and often this is a narrative logic. This happens and then that happens. or this happened because that happened, or this is relevant to me because. If material possessions, nationality, and security are all stripped away, what you know and what you tell take on enormous significance. Story may be literally all you can take with you. And here I want to mention my colleague Ma Vang's beautiful book, History on the Run, about Hmong refugee epistemologies and how they're shaped by structures of secrecy and forced migration. And although people who have been refugees might later inhabit very different lives, even lives of privilege and comfort after the time of their refugitude, the memory of exposure, of vulnerability persists, and it shapes how refugees continue to process and tell their lives. So refugees engage in story strategically, creatively, and continually. Story is a nimble capacity, a kind of personal resource. Sometimes story has very high stakes, such as when telling one's asylum story to meet a juridical threshold for protection. Sometimes the stakes are collective, as when refugees advocate for policy change, like the closure of detention centers. And then there are small moments of telling that produce the texture of everyday life. I think here of how, when I was growing up, my mother would sometimes summon my brother and me to dinner by calling, "Dang bao tinang ang cơm," or "Refugees, let's eat," as if she was a refugee camp administrator announcing mealtime with a bullhorn. And with that ironic command, she conveyed to us a memory of the camp, a sense of the power dynamics within that space and how they remained ever present, and our perseverance, the terms of our survival as she understood them. So for refugees, story happens all the time. And story matters. It shapes how people understand themselves and each other, which is to say it's inherently social and political. Story has ethical implications. To make story is to act upon, even intrude upon others' imaginations, compelling them to account for the teller's presence in a shared time space. Story can travel, shapeshift, confront, and enter others' conversations in ways that refugees embody cannot. Story establishes the teller as a person capable of making claims upon others. To return to Espiritu's phrasing, let's ask, what is the story of the refugee? Within that of, the story of the refugee, within that of lie a few possibilities. Stories about refugees, stories by refugees, stories that belong to refugees. These overlapping categories are capacious and maybe not entirely coherent. So take the category of stories by refugees for starters. There are stories that refugees tell to each other and to non-refugees. Stories held close, forgotten, or stowed by refugees. Even stories refugees wish they could forget. There are stories to which we carefully tend over many years or several generations, lovingly retelling them. There are stories we're proud of and don't mind broadcasting, and others that inspire caution because they revive a vulnerability that we struggle to shed. Then there is the fact that many stories by refugees, and that means much of refugee literature, cannot take form or circulate without cooperation by non-refugees. And this adds complexity to that ofness. What is the role of a translator, an advocate, a publisher, a mentor? How do these figures select and shape what we call literature by refugees? So recently I've been reading a special issue of Southerly, which is an Australian literary journal that came out last year called Writing Through Fences, Archipelago of Letters. It's a beautiful and harrowing collection of short writings by asylum seekers who are or were being detained by the Australian government. So I'd like to talk just for a few minutes about this collection, and then we can wrap up and hopefully have a discussion. So for the past decade, Australia has used offshore prisons that they call processing centers. And some of these are located on neighboring Pacific Island nations. Australia also funds detention centers throughout Indonesia and a couple other Southeast Asian countries because it has identified these countries as transit routes to Australia for asylum seekers who are coming from the Middle East or Africa or other places. So the context for this form of detention is that the Refugee Convention prohibits countries from turning away asylum seekers who arrive at their borders. And this is called the rule of non-refoulement. So nations are not allowed to reject asylum seekers at the border. So many nations, especially wealthier nations, in the last 2 decades have resolved not to allow asylum seekers to reach their borders. And the notorious Manus Island prison in Papua New Guinea recently closed, mostly, but the one on Nauru recently had its mandate extended indefinitely. So these are policies that are very much still present in Australia, and they're current subjects of much debate. So these facilities are part of a zero tolerance policy that began in 2013, in which the Australian government resolved that anyone attempting to enter Australia illegally by sea would never be resettled in Australia. So thousands of people have been intercepted and transferred to these prisons, and many have been there for years, sometimes 7, 8, or 9 years while being processed. So Writing Through Fences began in 2013 on Facebook, actually, and evolved as an online forum for refugee writers and artists who were or had been detained by the Australian government. And I'm showing you just a screenshot from their website, which, as far as I can tell, was most active around 2019. Social media have transformed how refugees communicate with each other and with various publics during transit and even from detention. And I would place the emergence of this group alongside those trends. Today, there are a couple of Facebook groups connected with Writing Through Fences, and many of the writers on the website also link to their Twitter or Instagram accounts. So I want to note the collective nature of this group and its implicit recognition that literature by current or recent refugees has basically no chance of reaching a broad audience without extensive collaboration and the marshaling of non-refugee networks and resources. This particular collaboration with Southerly is co-edited by 4 people: Hani Abdil, Behruz Buchani, Janet Galbraith, and Omid Tofigian. Abdil and Buchani are former detainees, and Buchani, you may have heard of, is a Kurdish Iranian journalist who now lives in New Zealand, and he's known for his memoir from Manus Prison, No Friend But the Mountains, which has been published globally. And he wrote the memoir by typing thousands of WhatsApp messages on a contraband cell phone, 4 of them actually, because they kept getting confiscated, and sending them to his editors abroad, who compiled, translated them, and got them published. While still imprisoned, Buchani won major literary prizes, including the Victorian Prize, which is a major national Australian prize. He gave a TED Talk, he gave his acceptance speech, to everything from prison. And he continued to write and tweet while he was imprisoned. His activism and public profile probably increased the political pressure to eventually close Manus Prison. In the introduction to Writing Through Fences, we learn that this volume of Southerly was originally conceived at the first book launch for No Friend But the Mountains in 2018 at the University of New South Wales. And the ideas were then further developed through other meetings, including an international MLA conference in Lisbon in 2019. So we can see just from the circumstances surrounding the anthology that numerous people, institutions, even corporations like Facebook were involved in its production. And then in the introduction also thanks a number of funders. So there's a lot that goes into an anthology like this coming to be. And I think that's all important to understand as we approach the refugee literature that's contained within it. So many of these writers, many of the writers in the anthology were not in a position to seek literary publishing on their own, even if that was a goal of theirs, which it very well might not be. And I would guess that for many of these writers, literary publishing was not a goal. These two 17-year-old detainees, Ibrahim and Abdi, are a good example of that. Both are writing from Christmas Island, which is Australian territory, in 2014 about the monotony, absurdity, and dehumanization of offshore detention. And both have their full names withheld, maybe for safety, maybe as a personal choice, we don't know. I'll just describe the left-hand poem by Ibrahim to you rather than reading it, since its visual impact is key. It's called Wait and consists of the word wait repeated again and again in a giant block of text that covers most of the page. And on the right hand, we have two short poems by Abdi, which I'll just read quickly. Two poems. One, they tell me I am from a third world. They tell me here is the first world. I am thinking in this first world, everything is looking beautiful, but there is nothing under the skin. Here they show for you a good face, but they are sick inside. Two, each day in Somalia, we take the goats and camels out, find food. Each day, we herd the goats and camels back to stick pens. It's like this with the island tours. We are goats and camels. They herd us out, bring us back, lock us away again. So in a very short space, these two pieces by juvenile detainee poets say a lot about their experiences as well as about Australia's detention policies. And the reason that these poems can have such a dramatic impact on us as non-detainee readers, is that they contradict dominant narratives about the refugee regime. So the dominant narratives emphasize the desirability of first world life. They offer the possibility of protection and rescue for third world refugees. They say that the refugee regime is about protecting and aiding refugees. So that refugee experience should be an experience of uplift or of possibility, salvation. And we see from both poets that, that this has not been their experience. So I'm not going to say much more about it. I think I'll wrap up there, and maybe we can look at those pieces together or think about other texts together. But like I said, I really welcome your reactions, your comments and questions, as these are all ideas that I'm actively working on right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, MaiLin. That was so powerful.